Hi, I'm Dr. Tracy Dennis-Tiwary, and I'm so pleased to be here as part of the See Mom Parenting in Place series. I'm a mom of two, and I'm also a professor of psychology and neuroscience at the City University of New York. And I'm the director of the Emotion Regulation Lab at Hunter College, where I study children's emotional well-being and anxiety. And I'm here today to talk about anxiety. First, how we can tell the difference between healthy and unhealthy anxiety. And then second, what we can do right now, 4 things we can do right now to help our kids cope with anxiety. So let's start first things first. What is anxiety? We all know what anxiety feels like. It's those jitters, that nervous feeling, those worries we sometimes have, anxious apprehension about future uncertainty. And in kids, anxiety can have many faces. So some anxious kids are shy and inhibited, and other anxious kids can be aggressive or impulsive. And sometimes we don't see the signs of anxiety in kids because they can be subtle if we're not looking for them. We also know that especially in early childhood, anxieties are a very normal part of development, so that we can expect that kids will have fear of the dark, that they'll be anxious about meeting strangers. Sometimes novelty will make kids anxious. And these are all very normal stages of development. So before I jump into what we can look for to distinguish healthy from unhealthy anxiety, I want to say that one of the most important things that we can do to help our kids with anxiety is to start to flip the script on how we might tell a story of anxiety in our lives. And we might want to consider that anxiety is not always an enemy, is not always a disease to be eradicated and avoided, that sometimes anxiety can actually be our ally, that we can work with our anxiety in productive ways and with our kids' anxiety as well. And this is because anxiety, from many ways of thinking, is actually a triumph of human evolution. It hinges on our ability, our unique human ability, to think into the future and to anticipate what's around the corner. And that's also the same human ability that allows us to hope and to dream. So anxiety, by allowing us to peek around the corner and anticipate what's around the bend, helps us prepare, helps us take protective measures when needed. We know anxiety during the pandemic has been tough, but has also been extremely useful. And anxiety can also be productive because when we're shifting into this future orientation, we pay attention more, we're more focused, more determined sometimes. So that's how anxiety is for our kids as well. It can be a superpower. So, as we think about helping our kids with anxiety, let's also consider the possibility that within a normal range, anxiety can really be something that kids can leverage to their advantage. And I want to outline 4 steps that can help us really help our kids do that very thing, to leverage anxiety as a strength rather than just a weakness. And those 4 steps are described by the acronym RAIN. So there's R for recognize, A for accept, I for investigate, and N for nurture. And I'll cover each in turn. So first, R for recognize. And this is where we can start to get into what distinguishes healthy from unhealthy anxiety. Now remember, kids are expected across the course of development to show some normal anxieties. And so one thing we can do as we recognize anxiety in our children is to make time as a family to discuss those difficult and challenging feelings. It can start to become a family habit where we talk very openly about anxiety and start to tune in to what it feels like and catch some of the early signs so that it doesn't start to veer into a danger zone. And when it does start to veer into a concerning level of anxiety, we can look for what I call the 4 Ds. And that's the D of disproportion, distress, duration, and dysfunction. So by disproportion, I mean that as we're recognizing anxiety in our kids and their fears and worries, we should try to track whether it's disproportionate in a consistent way with the challenges they're facing. So it's perfectly healthy and normal for a child to be very nervous or anxious on, say, the first day of school at a new school, but maybe after 6 months, that same level of anxiety, if it persists, may be disproportionate. So we can look out for that. The second D, which is distress, is we can track the levels of distress, the severity of distress and anxiety that our children are experiencing. So if we find that there's a very, very high level of distress, and that for the third D, that has a long duration. So combined with this long duration that's more than just a few days, that persists over weeks and months, that is another set of red flags that we should take seriously. And then the fourth and perhaps most important of the 4Ds is dysfunction. That is that anxiety is starting to get in the way of our kids being able to do developmentally appropriate things, whether that is socializing with peers, getting to school, trying new things. So if anxiety is starting to get in the way, then that's another red flag that lets us recognize that this might not be a healthy level of anxiety. So that's R for recognize. Next is A, accept. And here, in many ways, this might be the hardest of the RAIN strategies, because when we see our kids in distress, we're distressed. We're anxious when we see them anxious. And so it's very important for us to, for ourselves, accept our own fears of our child's fears and just try to accept without judgment for a few moments what our kids are experiencing so that we give them the space to have that full experience. And acknowledge that this emotion is real, it's valid, even if it's maybe even disproportionate or extreme or whatever we may judge about it, it is still okay to feel that feeling. So once we can find that space, we can start to help our kids face their fears and anxieties in a productive way. Now, this is particularly important because when we don't accept emotions as being okay, we can start to get into an avoidance cycle where we avoid all those feelings of anxiety and distress. And in anxiety, there's an avoidance paradox. The more we avoid anxiety, it actually results in more amplified and accelerated anxiety. So the more we avoid anxiety, the more that it tends to veer out of control. And this avoidance paradox is something that we can kind of think about in a lot of the negative emotions that we want to work with our kids. And a way to think about why avoidance is important to avoid is that it's also an opportunity cost. When children avoid all these experiences that are tough or tricky, all these experiences of anxiety, they never learn to cope with them. That is, it's an opportunity cost in terms of building the skills that are necessary to live with and thrive with those difficult emotions. An analogy here is that think about when our kids were learning to walk. It's really hard to see our kids fall and to maybe get bumped up a bit when they're learning how to walk. But if we rescued them from all of those bumps and falls, kids would never learn to pull themselves back up. They wouldn't even develop the right muscles that would allow them to walk as a toddler and then as a young person learning not just to walk but to run. And the same goes for anxiety. We have to help our kids develop those muscles, develop those skills to learn to cope. So that's A for accept. Now, I in RAIN is for investigate. And this is one of my favorites as a scientist because what investigate inspires us to do is to have an attitude of curiosity about emotions. So when we're curious about emotions, instead of trying to shut them down, they become less scary. Children and we realize that feelings are not forever, that we can investigate them and work with them. And it becomes something that we can actually have as a curious and interesting part of our lives. So when we're investigating emotional experiences and experiences of anxiety with our kids, it's important for us not to try to tell kids what they feel. Saying things like, oh, I'm sure you were really afraid when you saw that. Rather, we can practice having conversation starters where we open up the possibilities and don't assume that we understand exactly what our kids are feeling, even though we do want to be empathic. So for example, we might say, well, that was an interesting experience. What was that like for you? Or, some kids might feel scared in that situation. How did you feel? So when we investigate those emotions, we open up our kids' ability to tune into and discover what they feel in a given situation. And then the final letter in RAIN is N for nurture. And here we're nurturing our kids and our own ability to work with these difficult emotions like anxiety. We may start to, when we nurture our kids' experiences, may start to open up all sorts of problem-solving possibilities. So we can provide kids tips for how to deal with difficult emotions like anxiety in the moment and for their fears and worries. We can also empower them to discover, well, what helps you when you're feeling scared in that situation, when you're facing that fearful new day at school, or that new group of friends, or that thing that you're just nervous about? What are things that make you feel better, that allow you to push through and work with those fears? Again, it's important not to avoid and rescue our kids from all those feelings as we nurture their ability to cope with anxiety. There was a great study coming out of Yale that showed that when anxious kids, when their parents are trained to not help their kids avoid fearful situations, but actually to face some of those fears in a gradual and scaffolded way, that those kids actually had reductions in anxiety that were comparable to kids who directly received cognitive behavioral therapy from a therapist. So that the parents who were trained to bootstrap their kids' ability to face their fears gradually, that those kids were actually really able to tackle their high levels of anxiety and show improvement. Avoidance can be subtle. It's not always, of course, we're not always working with clinical or very debilitating levels of anxiety. My own son, who's now 12, when he was in third grade, he had some anxious moments one day when he forgot his homework. And so he was very upset. He was very distressed and worried. And so we problem solved. We worked together to find a solution, which we did. And his friend's mom emailed us a copy of the assignment, and he was able to write it down. But then what happened was a subtle kind of avoidance. He was very worried about how his teacher, Miss Z, would think about him, knowing that he'd forgotten his homework. And he said, "Mommy, can you just email Miss Z so that she knows that I didn't forget it and she doesn't think that I'm a kind of kid who would forget his homework?" And I had to do something really hard, which was I said, "Well, I know that you're worried about that, but I'm not going to email Miss Z because I want you to really work through those worries and really think about, okay, well, what can I do tomorrow to explain to Miss Z about the homework? And what can I do now to work through those feelings?" And we use some techniques that helped him work through those worries and feelings. So rather than rescue him, I let him work, kind of experience that anxiety. Sort of like when he was learning to walk, I let him fall down sometimes. And the next day he handed in his homework and he came right back at the end of school and was so excited to say, "Hey, look at what Miss Z wrote on my paper." And she wrote, "Great job figuring out how to get your homework done." So it was a really empowering experience for my son when he worked through that fear and anxiety and was able to come out the other side knowing that he'd figured it out. Part of nurturing is also building those new skills and allowing our kids to have those positive experiences. So that's RAIN. Recognize, accept, investigate, and nurture. Well, I hope those tips were helpful. Remember that we can tell a new story of anxiety in which it's an ally instead of always an enemy that we can work productively with. And we can look out for the 4 Ds, the red flags that maybe anxiety is starting to become something that gets in our children's way, and then we can seek more support. And we can also remember the RAIN strategies to help our kids work productively with their anxieties and fears. I'm wishing you well and all the best. Thanks.